Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for Business for America's webinar on Modernizing Congress, the business case to upgrade government. I'm Richard Idland, the National Policy Director for Business for America. And the reason we're holding this webinar today is to really focus on the significant changes that have been made in how Congress is operating over the past 4 years in particular. And our premise is that a more functional Congress will help to address some of the fundamental challenges the U.S. economy, U.S. political system is facing. So today's conversation is going to hear from a number of experts who've been working on the effort to modernize Congress, both inside and outside the Capitol Hill. So I think it'll be an interesting conversation, and one that very much relates to the role that business can play in helping to make a case for a more functional, less partisan, more effective Congress, both in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. So welcome again, everyone. And let me just quickly tell you a little bit about Business for America. For those of you who don't know, we are a national, nonpartisan, not-for-profit organization. We have been working over the past 4 or 5 years on making the business case for a healthy democracy, and have been working on voting rights, election security, election funding, civic education, and a number of other important initiatives that we feel help to strengthen the institutions that run our society, and making the business case that a more functional political system increases stability and produces positive economic results. So today's conversation about the important role of modernizing Congress is really, in that general vein of ways to strengthen our democracy, increase trust in the institutions, and obviously produce some better set of outcomes for the American public, and particularly for the business community, which obviously has a vested interest in a more functional U.S. Congress. So just some quick background here on the issue that we're going to be discussing. In 2018, 6 Democrats and 6 Republicans formed the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress. That was an initiative that grew out of a set of recommendations about the importance of upgrading how Congress operated. And over the past 4 years, those members of Congress have worked hand in hand in a remarkably bipartisan fashion to develop a set of several hundred recommendations, many of which, dozens and dozens of which, have already been adopted over the past 4 years. And we're going to learn more about the significance of those recommendations. And the effort essentially was to increase the professionalism and capacity of each office in Congress to function more effectively, to use new technology, to interact with constituents in a more effective way, and also, most importantly, to find ways to work in a bipartisan and more civil manner. The bipartisan committee's work ended at the end of the 117th Congress, at the end of 2022. And it has fortunately now been made part of a subcommittee within the House, and we'll learn more about that. So the work continues, which is very exciting. Let me quickly introduce our speakers, and I'll do it in the order that we're going to hear from them. Betsy Wright Hawkins is going to be our first presenter. Betsy spent several decades working on Capitol Hill, including work as the chief of staff for 4 congressional offices. Betsy was also a senior fellow within the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress, and has great insight into the mechanics of the process and some of the significant consequences. In 2019, Betsy established her own consulting firm called Article 1 Advisors. And prior to that work, and earlier on in her career, she was a managing director with the Democracy Fund. Brad Fitch is the president and CEO of the Congressional Management Foundation, And Brad became the president in 2010. He had previously been the deputy director of CMF for a number of years. Brad is a seasoned Washingtonian. He spent 36 years in DC working as a journalist, time on Capitol Hill as chief of staff, college instructor at American University, and internet entrepreneur. And Brad is also the author of the Citizens Handbook to Influencing Elected Officials. Third, we'll hear from Jabin Castro. Jabin is the Deputy Director for the Office of Diversity and Inclusion in the U.S. House of Representatives. That institution, that group was started in 2019, I believe, in the 116th Congress. And Jabin leads the outreach and engagement strategies to Republican offices within the House of Representatives. His previous experience on Capitol Hill included serving as the outreach director for the U.S. Senate Republican Task Force on Hispanic Affairs under Senator Orrin Hatch. And Jabin also has some experience that he brings to this conversation from the private sector, where he was involved with a number of companies on corporate social responsibility issues. And finally, we'll hear from Travis Moore. Travis is the executive director and founder of FixCongress, which gives talented technologists the opportunity to gain firsthand experience working in Congress and learning about federal policymaking and bringing their technology skills to Congress and committees, hopefully benefiting those entities in adopting modern approaches to technology. Previously, Travis was a legislative director for Representative Henry Waxman, the former chair and ranking member of the House Energy and Commerce Committee. So thank you all very much for joining us. And Betsy, let's start with your sort of a bit of the history of the Select Committee and some of the insights that you have about the significance of the committee's work over the past 4 years.
Sure, I'd be happy to. And first of all, let me just say, Richard, thanks so much for this opportunity. I'm just so grateful to be here with several of these guys who have just been leaders over the last 4 years in this effort. And as you said, I'll talk just a little bit about the history of the Modernization Committee, what it was able to accomplish, and why I think it's been a successful model that's worthy of further investment. There really are several factors that have combined to make it uniquely successful. In my, as you noted, rather long history working in Congress, and I think they're still present. And I think the business community can really help leverage those factors. And that's one reason I'm just so grateful that that Business for America is stepping in and raising this issue up. So thank you for that. Congress has historically taken a look at its own operations and how they can be improved about once in a generation. About once every 25 or 30 years, somebody in Congress says, hey, we could probably do this better. There have been various efforts in the 1940s, 1974, 1993. The 2019 Modernization Committee was actually the result of a bipartisan group of former leadership staff who got together back in 2015 because they were concerned about the loss of agency by the first branch of government, the legislative branch. And they wrote various letters and were concerned and were issuing press releases as a group. That issue then was taken up by a couple of sophomore members of Congress, a Republican and Democrat, whose fathers had both served in the House. And then a bipartisan coalition of nonprofit organizations who support Congress, who became later known as the FixCongress Cohort, came together behind that bill. And Congressional Management Foundation was part of that original group. So was Bipartisan Policy Center. So was Congressional Institute. There were several others. But they got behind that bill early on back in 2016, 2017, and their advocacy led to the establishment of the original Modernization Committee back in early 2019 as part of the rules package for the 116th Congress. Originally, it was only set up for 1 year, but with their support, the Modernization Committee posted some early wins. It was clear, though, that there was more to do after about 6 months. And so with the active support, again, of the cohort, the cohort went to work and said, there's going to need to be another year of this committee. And so they went to work, and the committee was given an extension through 2020. So by the end of 2020, the committee had posted 97 bipartisan recommendations to try to strengthen the institution of Congress, the first branch of government. Some examples of the kinds of changes that had been made included increasing transparency in the legislative process to allow the American people and, frankly, congressional staff and members to track how amendments were changing legislation and how proposed legislation that was on the floor was going to change current law. That was something that you just didn't know unless you were a lawyer and you could figure it out, but you were voting on it. So a good thing. Encouraging bipartisanship by establishing bipartisan committee staff briefings and agenda setting retreats. That's something that businesses do all the time to get their teams on the same pages, but something that just doesn't regularly happen in Congress. Strengthening congressional capacity and increasing staff retention, which was a real problem because the average tenure of a staffer was at that point down below 2 years. So there was no time to really develop expertise. So standardizing onboarding training for new staff, making permanent the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, which by that point had been established, surveying staff to try to identify ways to improve benefits, and just better understanding the universe of employees to try to understand how to keep them. What would be needed to keep employees for longer than 19, 20, 24 months was something that the House undertook intentionally, really for the first time as a result of recommendations of the committee. Identifying cost savings, expanding new member orientation and doing more of it on a bipartisan basis, improving the accessibility of congressional buildings and broadcasts and websites, which really had not been much of a priority in any intentional way. Revitalizing House technology, which I think Travis will talk more about, and it's his area of expertise, but through all kinds of reforms related to vendors, service delivery, software development, assessing technology policy, which the House had lost much of its expertise in over the previous 20 years. Identifying ways to anonymize but aggregate data so that the House could better identify trends in constituent problems so that they could better solve and track constituent problems over time. And then strengthening continuity of operation requirements and support for offices in the event of, for example, a pandemic. There were office to office, not requirements or plans for continuity of operations, and then scheduling reforms so that offices could, the two scheduling reforms that I would identify as most important were the committee calendar deconfliction so that members could not be required to be in 3 committee meetings in the same time. And also a requirement that Congress meet in DC for more days than it was traveling. In 2019, Congress actually traveled for 66 days and was in Washington for 65 days, and that just didn't make any sense. So at the end of 2020, with a growing to-do list and a mandate from the freshmen to take on some even bigger issues, the cohort went to work again. And the committee was given a full 2-year extension for the entire 117th Congress. Again, you can tell as I go through these lists, I'm just giving you the very highlights of, the 97 recommendations. I'm giving you just top lines of, the best of the best, right? But there were, by the end of the 117th Congress, we were up to 202 bipartisan recommendations. 45 of them had been fully implemented, and 88 of them had been partially implemented. And as you mentioned, now there's been a subcommittee that's been established. The Modernization Committee has not been extended for another Congress, but the subcommittee that of the House Administration Committee has been established to carry that work forward. I can identify additional recommendations if you'd like me to, that came out of the 117th Congress. There were some important ones that did come out, having to do with constituent service, more on congressional continuity and technology. But I would also, just in the few remaining minutes that I have, like to make one other point, because I think it leads into what I think Brad's going to talk about. I think that the committee and the cohort are both proven models, and they're proven models that are worthy of further investment. And among the committee's most potentially lasting contributions to the House, because the model that the committee established is one that any other committee in the House could adopt tomorrow. And actually the House Administration Subcommittee on Modernization has adopted it. As you mentioned, among the committee's most lasting contributions is just, as you can see here, right? There were 6 Republicans, 6 Democrats. And that was important because there was no majority, no minority. There were 2 staff directors, a Republican staff director and a Democratic staff director. There was 1 budget. I know Brad's going to talk more about this. But from the beginning, they met as one group. They set priorities together. As I mentioned, they did a retreat together. They set about agreeing together on what the problems were, and they said, as Chairman Kilmer liked to say, we're all on the same team. We don't have red jerseys or blue jerseys. We all wear FixCongress jerseys, and he actually got jerseys made that were FixCongress jerseys. And that original picture that was stuck on the front of the slide deck for too long actually was the FixCongress jersey photograph. So at least you all got a good look at that. And if you could go to the next slide. Yeah, those were the recommendations that I read through. And the other important point was they worked with the implementing partners up front to get buy-in, so that, and that was an important point about the way that they worked on implementation, so that, it wasn't a report at the end of the year. They were working on implementation from the beginning. And that's one way that the model was just a very important, it made the model very successful from the beginning, is and especially in the 3rd and 4th year, in the 2nd iteration of the committee, they were working on implementation all along. And so that is part of what has made this such an established and successful model. And again, working alongside the cohort, which was a bipartisan group also from the outside, they really worked hand in glove. And so that has been an important piece that just, again, it's a proven model. So now we have the House Administration Committee, again, the same model, equal number Republicans and Democrats. Derek Harley, the staff director, was the Republican staff director, so he's got that continuity as well. The cohort continues to exist. Continues to work. I know we'll continue to work alongside Derek and Mr. Kilmer. We don't know yet what Chairwoman Bice's agenda will be specifically, but I think it is reasonable to assume that she will start as Chair Kilmer did at the beginning of the 116th Congress, with early wins that will make a quick difference to members and will be immediately and easily felt in the lives of members and staff, in order to make the Congress an easier place to work, and in ways that will be immediately felt in order to make the work of the committee felt in a rapid way, and that will continue to build the constituency. And I think this is where the business community can really play a role. The Modernization Committee was not widely known, but whoever heard of its work when they did, just consistently felt better about Congress and how it could work for the American people. You would tell the story, oh, wow, there's a committee that's working together on a bipartisan basis, 202 recommendations. Are you kidding me? People, when they heard about it, just, they didn't believe it, but they loved it. And I think, it'll take time, but if we can continue to build on the work of the Modernization Committee and more of Congress can work more effectively, this work can continue to make a difference.
Great.
And so I just think investing in that proven model, both of the committee, but I would also say of the cohort, frankly, because they work together. And I think you've got, you've got the leadership of people like Brad and Travis and frankly, Jabin, who, are just committed to this work. And I'm incredibly grateful for it. One
Great.
last point,
Yes.
Members do what they're rewarded for. If you want to change congressional behavior, it helps to change what you ask and praise them for. So you have to create a market for the change that you seek. And that's the role that the cohort has played. I just want to specifically say that. The cohort helped create a market for changed congressional behavior. They helped to change the incentives and rewards by rewarding members of Congress for working on the institution and supporting the institution. And the business community can help expand that market going forward. And that's why this is so important and where the business community can really make a contribution.
Okay. Betsy, thank you for that overview. That's very informative and I think sets the stage for the rest of the conversation. And Brad, before you take it over, I just wanted to remind everyone that, Business for America's objective, to amplify what Betsy just said, is to launch a campaign that involves businesses, trade associations, business groups, all of whom deal with Congress in a variety of manner. And maybe, improving the operation of Congress is not your top priority, or, protecting our democracy is not, top of mind. But as Betsy suggested, a more functional Congress that operates in a civil way that can address, long-term structural problems in our economy and society is really critical to all businesses' interests. So we'll be in touch with you about this evolving campaign and welcome your involvement. Brad, if you want to pick up from where Betsy left off and, tell us the success story here, and particularly, the impact of outside groups in encouraging and incentivizing Congress to take action.
Well, as you introduced me, Richard, you know that I've been in Washington now for 37 years, and I can say with great affirmation that the last 4 years in my work with the Modernization Committee has been the most amazing and rewarding work that I've done as an institutionalist in the Congress. And as Betsy said, it has not been a story that has been well told or told beyond the Beltway. As I describe, it's a little bit like CMF's reputation. Some people have a reputation that's a mile wide and an inch deep. The Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress has support that's a mile deep and an inch wide. Those people that know the work that it's done have been blown away by it. And I just had Chip drop in the chat an article from the Washington Post that was published just last week by Amanda Ripley, which is probably one of the best descriptions and for free media descriptions of what's happened, in which she talked about these radically simple changes help members of Congress get things done. And that was a really interesting part of watching this happen. As Betsy noted, the committee did something that very few committees and members did. In March of 2019, they held an offsite bipartisan meeting where most of the committee spent 6 hours in the Library of Congress building thrashing things out. There were only a few staffers there and only a couple of outsiders allowed, and I was one of them for those 6 hours. And I can tell you, folks, If I could have gotten the 380 million Americans who live in this country in that room for those 6 hours, you would have a completely different view of the United States Congress, because they thrashed through issues. They talked about their shared values. They talked about their shared commitments to the Congress and to the country and to their constituents. And it was just an amazing thing. And then that was just the beginning. As Betsy noted, there were a couple things that were very different: equal bipartisan nature, joint committee staff. This was a little subtle change that Chairman Kilmer did back in 1995 when the Republicans took over. They did something that was frankly just a little, I thought, snivelly, frankly. They changed the titles, and the Democrats no longer were known as vice chairman. That went to another Republican. Well, Kilmer said, that's not the way we're going to do it. We're going to send a signal right now that this is our vice chairman. So his first vice chairman, Tom Graves of Georgia, was a vice chairman, and they clearly were partners, as he was with his partner in the last Congress, William Timmons, a Republican from South Carolina. As Betsy noted, there were rotating leaders and chairs. At one point, when they were talking about orientation and how to improve the onboarding process for new members, the chair and ranking and vice chairman gave up the gavel to the two sophomore and freshman members on the committee. And by the way, giving up the gavel is not something chairs like to do in Washington, D.C. in the United States Congress. It was amazing to watch them do a great job. They also worked in subgroups. What would happen is, especially in the first Congress before the pandemic, two members of the committee, a Democrat and a Republican, work on scheduling or something else. And then they come to the broader committee of 12 with a bipartisan consensus. It was brilliant. You should one note about Chairman Kilmer, the chairman of the committee from outside of Seattle and Washington. He's a former McKinsey facilitator and McKinsey. So he comes from the business community. And I can tell you, having watched him operate as a professional facilitator myself, it was like watching a maestro in front of an orchestra, because he knew what to move, but he didn't overplay his hand. He let people shine, but he also kept things on time. It was really a great business example. There was a fair amount of socializing that went on that really helped people move things along. And as Betsy noted, we had a different seating chart. It wasn't all the D's on the left and all the R's on the right. It was Democrat, Republican, Democrat, Republican. So you kind of had to work together. The timeline was kind of amazing, as Betsy said. One of the things they did early on, which I really liked, is some of the phrases that happened in Washington is, and this happened at the first meeting of the cohort. Somebody said, we got to go big or go home. And I objected immediately, because I'm tired of going home, because that's all we've been doing for 50 flipping years. Is been working on reform. It hasn't happened. The bipartisan committee on budget reform failed. Erskine Bowles and Simpson's plan failed. Everybody goes big and everybody just goes home. And so I rejected that. I didn't know that Kilmer had the same attitude. And so what they did was they kept releasing these small successes. And you know this in business, nothing succeeds like success. It creates momentum. It creates incentives to go more. And then they met some deadlines. The first year, they got their recommendations done. The second year, they got a resolution passed by the House of Representatives. During the pandemic, they kept the committee hearing going. I can tell you, Betsy and that poor staff over at the Modernization Committee were run ragged. One of the accomplishments, though, that she didn't mention, I want to call out, which was one that just really amazing, and they actually did go big. They decided they wanted to come up with a new system to restore Congress's ability to spend money in their own districts, what used to be called as earmarks. And they came up with a proposal that blew me away. I had my own sort of outside small proposal for earmark reform. What Kilmer and Graves and the other team did was just amazing. They called it, first of all, change the name, community funded projects, significant restrictions, significant transparency. There are hospitals that are getting extra wings this year because of the Modernization Committee. There are bridges that are being built. There are food banks and other nonprofits that are getting correct congressionally directed spending that was identified by their member of Congress as a worthy candidate for federal spending, because the Modernization Committee proposed a new system. The Appropriations Committee under Rosa DeLauro adopted it, a Democrat, in 2021. And now, amazingly, the Republicans have decided to keep it. There's a double negative in this headline. I hate this headline, but they voted down a ban, which means they adopted earmark by a 2-to-1 margin vote in the Republican House conference. This is an incredible win for the American public and for the Congress to restore its Article I authority under the Constitution to make spending decisions. And I did an analysis of these things. looking back in 2010, a lot of money was spent on military construction, a lot of money going to DOD. Basically, the old earmark system was, let's find the oldest guy in the room and let's give him the most money. And then the second oldest guy gets the second amount. That's not the way the new system works. It gets vetted, it's meritorious, it's public, it's transparent. And 3/4 of all members of Congress are now seeking funding under the new system. And I think that number is going to go up under the Republicans. Finally, I just wanted to touch on what Richard and Betsy had talked about, which is the FixCongress Cohort. It was a bipartisan group, mostly nonprofits who don't lobby Congress. There are a few groups that do have advocacy efforts, but most people are simply interested in seeing government function better. And I'll be honest with you, I'm a bit of a wary person when it comes to coalitions. I'm not saying I don't play well with others. I think I do, but I was a little nervous about going into this. And the first couple of months was a little bumpy as we tried to figure out what we're going to do. But these meetings have been some of the most meaningful interactions I've had. We worked really well together. There's a lot of respect for each other. There's a lot of work to do. I mean, I remember when I was looking at, and Travis will speak to this, I think Travis was involved with Lincoln Network putting together some of the early technology memos for the Modernization Committee back in 2019. And I looked at the first draft of the memo and I was like, I understand maybe 10% of this shit. I'm not going to get involved. It's not my level of expertise. I do training, I do HR, I do professional support. And so there was this sort of a self-selection process among the cohort that evolved, and it meant that people weren't bumping into each other. The last thing I'm going to say, and Richard touched on this and Betsy did too, the importance of Business for America coming into this conversation, specifically the modernization movement, is so important because your voice and your background and your credibility in getting things done is a great example for the United States Congress. You notice that management is my middle name, and I've wanted to get more business ideas infused into Congress. Before I came back to CMF, I created an internet startup that got bought out, and I was in corporate America for a few years. Really glad I'm not part of that. God bless you all for being part of it, but not my cup of tea. Anyway, the point is that we need you. We need the people from the business community telling the Congress it can improve, helping perhaps to show them a way. And that's what Travis is doing. And I know he's going to talk about that in his conversation, bringing those business ideas into a government setting. And my last quote I'll remind you is, I think, an important charge for all of you, coming from a politician who said this: politics is too important to be left to politicians. And that, I think, is a great charge for the Business for America participants. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. Looking forward to your questions, and I'll give it back to Richard for our next speaker.
Great. Brad, thank you. Also very informative and help shape, I think, the sort of the call to action, which is, again, for businesses to lend their expertise and insights into how organizations can be run effectively with a wide set of stakeholders, which is what Congress certainly needs to keep track of, as do businesses. So with that in mind, let's turn to Jabin Castro. And Jabin, I think one of the real insights you have offered, in discussions we've had, is that there are best practices adopted in the private sector that the public sector, i.e. Congress, hasn't really caught up with. And one of those was certainly in the recognition of the value of having a diverse and inclusive workforce, and that certain hiring practices need to be highlighted and emphasized in order to ensure that the staff of Congress is representative of the country. So tell us a bit about the work you've been doing in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion in the House, if you would.
Sure, Richard. First, thanks for inviting me to be a part of this. It's always great to be in a group with friends that we've been working together for a while, trying to get this work done. So just to give you a little bit of background, yes, it was actually, the office was actually started or established March of 2020. So not 2019. That was the rules package was passed then, but the actual establishment of the office wasn't until March of 2020. That's when Committee on House Admin, alongside leadership on both sides of the aisle, came together and put two of us together to kind of come up with this whole thing. the wonderful thing about this office, though, is, when this office was established through the Committee on House Admin, both sides of the aisle, we've been reporting to leadership on both sides of the aisle. So that's like, to me, that's what got me back here, back to Congress, because as you mentioned, I worked in the Senate for Senator Orrin Hatch till he retired. I actually went back to corporate to keep doing, making sure that, you're a good corporate community citizen, right? So I went back to that work. But when I got the phone call for this opportunity, what caught my attention was that you had, at the time, Speaker Pelosi and Republican leader McCarthy, who we report to, that said, hey, this is an issue that we want to get in front of. We want to get this done correctly. So because I think, diversity, equity, inclusion doesn't belong to one party. In the way that it can get done, in the way that we have been successful, is by having leadership, support from both sides of the aisle, support from leadership on both sides of the aisle. And yes, while there are some issues in the House that are unique, challenges that are unique to the House that corporate does different, I'm still very excited to be doing the work, because, when it comes to policy, it's that diversity and experience that we're after, right? So when you're talking about any policy that Congress writes, which honestly is everything that affects us on our everyday life, it's having that diverse experience with staff that will make that policy even better, right? And that's where our office comes in, is to help with staffers. Obviously, we don't do anything with elected members. That's you, the voters, who go to the voting booth and elect the members. But the staff that are helping with the everyday running of the office, the policy research, the policy writing, pushing the bill on the House floor, that's where we come in, and that's where we are helping Congress look more like America.
And Jabin, so you also noted, which I thought was very interesting, that in Congress, you have 541, I think, small businesses, as you described, right? And so, it's not like the CEO of a large, Fortune 1000 company, he or she can decide with colleagues, this is how we're going to be doing, diversity and inclusion hiring and training, so everybody get on board. So how does this momentum in Congress spread? How does an individual congressional office adopt these recommendations? And
no. I mean, I always love to make that point, because it is true. In any company, you have a CEO and president that will say, hey, Richard is the diversity guy, and the policies that Richard makes for the company, everybody has to listen to it. You even have a HR that might help you, get those policies set up. Here in the House, we don't have a centralized HR, so there's no help there. And then, we don't have a president or CEO. We have a speaker. And while, back in March of 2020, when then Speaker Nancy Pelosi announced that the office had been established, it is up to us to kind of help with those relationships in moving forward what we're trying to accomplish. And while we do have relationship or support from both sides of the aisle, now obviously Speaker McCarthy on one end and Leader Jeffries on the other end, that's how we've been able to be successful, is because, we are a resource office. So as a resource office, we're here to help, and our resources, concentrate on 4 main areas. Candidate services. This is where we help anyone who's currently on the Hill looking to move up in their career, or anyone off the Hill that want to work in Congress. And so that falls down into different things. We'll do one-on-ones to help you with your resume, right? So like, what does a resume on the Hill even looks like? You know, if you've never worked on the Hill, you don't know it. And some people might be confused thinking, oh, it's federal government. Yes, we're federal. But that to some people means usajobs.com, which it's a big headache to me. I never liked that website. But anyway, my point is, you know, you go there, you're thinking, oh, I can do a resume like USA Jobs tells me to do a resume. And you come back to the Hill with 6-page long resume. That doesn't work on the Hill. So, you know, we help you figure out, you know, what a resume looks like. We also even do mock interviews that is not just for like current Hill staffers, but again, people who want to find jobs on the Hill. And we are also going into the communities to educate communities that there are careers on the Hill. You know, I mean, I often use myself as an example. I was 28 years old, 10 years in the military, 28 years old. I'm in DC working corporate, and I meet someone at a networking event and conversation leads to where you work. I'm like, oh, I do, you know, public affairs, diversity in corporate. What do you do? And they're like, oh, I work on the Hill. What Hill?
Right,
I honestly did not know what they were talking about.
Right.
And so, you know, that's part of this, you know, candidate services is getting the information that there are careers into our communities, right? We also do research and data analytics. You know, there was no data being collected on what diversity looked like on the Hill prior to our office. We also do training, you know, we do training on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in the workplace. You know, we do training on bringing yourself to work, implicit bias. We also do programming. Our next big programming is actually on Monday night. We're doing a Black History Month, big programming where we are celebrating, you know, Leader Jeffries on breaking history, you know. So, you know, those are the kind of things that we do. In the way that we're able to do this, and again, become successful because it is building those relationships with all 441 members, because like you said, they are small businesses,
right,
is by being able to walk into a space and being able to say, yes, we work with leadership on both sides of the aisle. Our office is here as a resource office to help everyone, because both sides of the aisle, both leaderships want this to be done. And I would say 9 out of 10 times in one way or another, the response that I get back from chief of staffs, because, you know, back in March of 2020, when we opened the door, we didn't know. It was a brand new office. We don't know what's going to happen, right? But every single time I talk to a chief of staff about the resources that we have is mainly, wow, where were you guys before? Why wasn't this available when I was an intern?
Right.
Why wasn't this available when I didn't know how to get access to jobs on the Hill? You know, wow, this is, you know, we've needed this. That is literally the one way or another, that is the answer I get from chief of staffs. Because obviously that's your way into an office, right? It's having these conversations with these chief of staffs, because it allows us to, whether you're on the Hill or off the Hill, it allows us to give resumes to the hiring managers. If you've ever tried to find a job on the Hill, you understand that the hardest part is just to get someone to actually read your resume. You know, for any jobs, whether that's an intern all the way to chief of staff, I mean, if an office puts it out into the world that they're looking for resumes, they're going to get 150, 200 resumes. You know, I told you that our office started with 2 of us. We're now a team of 10. For one of the positions we hired, we had 560 resumes that came in the door, you know? So when you have so much, what's the likelihood of your resume actually being looked at, right? So that's like part of it.
Yeah.
And what makes it easy for that chief of staff is if they come to me, they know that we've already looked at the resume, we've done a mock interview, we've kind of vetted this person before you even come to us, and we're going to send over the most qualified resume. So that makes it easier on the hiring manager, and that makes it easier on the job seeker, because if we give you a resume over, there's a very good likelihood that your resume is actually going to be looked at. Good. After that, we can't do anything after that, but at least we can help your resume get in the right hand. Good. And so that's what made us successful with the relationships with these offices, because of, you know, Speaker McCarthy and Leader Jeffries having support of the office.
Great, good. Jay, but I know there's more to add to that, because hiring and retaining staff is really critical. But let's move to another really key issue. Travis, you've been thinking a lot about, like Jabin, how do you bring some of the better practices from the private sector into Congress, particularly technology, and bringing technology experts and tools, to the better use for Congress. So first, just describe what Tech Congress does, and then, the nature of the support that you all have been providing in this process to modernize Congress, if you would.
Yeah, absolutely. So first, thank you, Richard, and Business for America for having me and for us in this conversation. So also caveat, I'm speaking on my personal behalf and not of Tech Congress here, but I always like to start with, we'll do a virtual show of hands. I can't see everyone, obviously, but if folks remember when Mark Zuckerberg testified in 2018 and some of the questions he got about how Facebook worked, essentially we are attempting to solve for that. And some of those questions, that is in part due to a brain drain. And Congress's inability to recruit and retain the talent that represents the lived experience, and that includes expertise and tech expertise that we need in this country. And so at Tech Congress, we recruit and place computer scientists, engineers, and other technologists to serve mostly as tech policy advisors. So things like privacy, disinformation, AI, but also in the digital and tech infrastructure domain. And our goal is to help show Congress what is possible, to prime the pump for them so that they can solve these problems themselves. For a variety of reasons, politically, it is really hard for Congress to build new things. But we have some great case studies through the Modernization Committee about how an entity can carry some political risk with a creative structure, and some really great wins. Betsy pointed to the Modernization Committee was initially supposed to be a year. It ended up becoming 4 years. We had an increase in staff pay for the first time in a decade, really to get staff back to 2010 levels. The House now has a digital service. This is the first digital service in any legislative branch in the country, and they're charged with improving and modernizing the tools and the infrastructure that Congress needs. So to give a quick example, prior to COVID, in order to introduce a bill, you printed it out on a piece of paper, you walked it down a hallway into the Capitol, and you dropped it in a wooden box called the hopper. It was not because anybody thought that we shouldn't have an electronic bill signatures system. It was because we needed a body that could work on these things. As Jabin pointed out, Congress is a decentralized institution. And so absent mechanisms to bring folks together in a centralized way, it's really hard for offices to innovate. A couple other wins, the Government Accountability Office, which is a service organization of Congress. For every dollar they spend, we save over $200 in taxpayer dollars. They now have a science and tech assessment office. So some really, really great, we have the modernization subcommittee with in-house administration, some really great early wins. And my message to the business community is that we need to keep this going. And I think that we can do this in two core ways. One is to keep what is working. And so there's $10 million that we're spending in the House each year to implement the Modernization Committee recommendations. We need to maintain that, if not improve it. We also need to maintain staff pay so that we can recruit and retain the best and the brightest. And then the second thing we need to do is we need to iterate. So we should do this in the Senate. Alan, to your question in Q&A, the Senate Rules Committee is the jurisdiction here. Anyone that is from Minnesota or Nebraska in the audience, if so, we need your voice because the leaders there are Amy Klobuchar from Minnesota and Deb Fisher from Nebraska. They need to hear from you that it's important to do this work in the Senate. And then lastly, we need more mechanisms for bringing in outside expertise. Other levels of government have figured this out. In the Department of Defense, we have a Defense Business Board. And they exist to consult the business community on best practices to bring inside. We have a Defense Innovation Board that consults Silicon Valley. There's no reason we can't have a Congressional Innovation Board or some type of entity that works with the business community to bring in outside experts to support congressional modernization. And I just want to end with one story, and that's Jasmine Suarez. Jasmine is a fellow of ours. She's an IT professional by training. She's the first in her family to go to college. She's a cancer survivor, and she just got a fellowship with the Senate Homeland Security Committee. She is exactly the kind of person that we need in Congress. She wants to stay in Congress, but absent decent salaries, Jasmine can't stay. Jasmine wants to start a family. And so we need more Jasmines, and the business community really, as Betsy alluded to, we need to create a market, continue this market for members to act and build their own capacity. So I will end there.
Great. Travis, thank you. Let me ask you a follow-up question about the use of technology. So, all offices use email. They have a tremendous amount of incoming notices and invitations. There are people who are, still using fax machines, phone calls. So when I've been in congressional offices, I typically see the front office managed by people in their young 20s. So how are you working with the current staff within offices who assumably are more tech savvy than their bosses?
Yeah, primarily through the fellowship program. So we sent 23 fellows to Congress across the political spectrum, Republicans and Democrats, and the fellows come in, and the fellows help show offices the art of the possible. What they've worked on, a number come from tech, a number come from the national security domain, but to help offices understand, these are the tools, these are the mechanisms, and this is the way that we think about. And I think this is what's, the expertise is important, but the problem solving, I will say, what I think tech has done well as a sector is not necessarily technology, but it's a system for problem solving. It's the lean startup methodology. And so they bring this method of learning and iteration that I think is a really helpful perspective. And ideally they stay on. I mean, our goal is for fellows to get hired on afterward. We think that's how Congress first and foremost can begin to solve these problems, is by hiring tech expertise and by hiring our fellows.
Okay, thank you. Good. Brad, let me go back to you for a moment here. There seems to be a cultural gap, right? So there's lots of innovation happening out in society. We heard from Jabin about companies with exemplary diversity and inclusion training programs, from Travis about the adoption of technologies, the lean startup mode. But Congress has not necessarily been in the vanguard of adopting these practices. Is there some reason that we should be thinking about, besides politics is different than the way the private sector works? But how might we sort of think about the challenges that Congress faces in moving more quickly?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is money. I did a back of the envelope analysis of how much the House is spending on diversity and how much Google is spending on diversity. And Google is spending about 75 times more, not twice, not 3 times, 75 times more on diversity. And so when Congress spends money on diversity or to technology for better computers, it gets accused of, quote unquote, spending money on itself, not realizing that its mission is to serve the American public, and it eventually does serve the American public. So part of the challenge is swatting down this Congress spending money on itself. And again, the Modernization Committee provided political cover on some levels to make that happen. And there has been increases in funding for the Congress and the legislative branch. By the way, it represents, a fraction of what the rest of the government costs. And you get a good return on your money. So I think that's one of the biggest problems, is getting Congress to focus and allow it to give himself the resources, whether it's diversity, inclusion, technology, better pay for staff retention. I'm not saying that that's the end all be all solution. I asked somebody once, if I double Congress's budget, I'm going to get twice as good at Congress. And Probably not. But I can tell you right now, if we don't do something about right now member pay, which has gone down with inflation, probably a total of buying power over 20% in the last decade, because Congress can't find a way to pay itself. We're going to start seeing people just completely just walk away from this job. And the only one you're going to get working in Congress are people who are rich and can afford to.
Well, and if I could just build on Brad's point, I mean, we had yet another member resign, announced today that he's resigning, 6 months into his term. And I'm not critical of that, right? But the point is, we're going on nearly 30 years of this trend of members on both sides of the aisle running campaigns to sit in a body. And the basis of their campaign is how terrible the body is, right? I mean, the campaigns on both sides of the aisle are based on how terrible Congress is.
Right.
And so, that's what they're serving up to the public. And so you can't really blame the public for believing that Congress is a terrible place. And you can't really blame the public for not supporting Congress investing in itself. And so this is fundamentally about reversing that trend and helping people believe that Congress is worth investing in. And the Modernization Committee has shown that Congress can work, and the Modernization Subcommittee will continue that effort. And the FixCongress Cohort and the organizations that are part of that have been amplifying the work of the Modernization Committee that shows that Congress can work. And hopefully there will be other committees that will continue to show that. And hopefully, the work of the staff like Jabin and the great work of Travis and Brad and others will continue to show that as well.
Okay, great. Thank you, Betsy. Jabin, did you have a quick comment you wanted to make? We have just a minute, but if you want to add.
I just saw the two questions on there, and just wanted to real quick. For the one that was looking at students who want to work on the Hill as an intern, I think my contact info is being put on the chat right now. Our office, that's literally what we do. It's help you find internships or jobs on here. So feel free to send me an email. I'll be more than happy to do that. There was also another questions about any pushback from members. When we talk about diversity, I mentioned experience, which means when we look at diversity from our office, it's not just race, ethnicity, gender, veterans like myself. It also includes regional diversity. We find out that about 52% of the staff in DC are from the East Coast, which makes sense. As a Floridian coming to DC, someone from New York coming to DC makes sense. So we need to, think about, regional diversity, getting staffers from Minnesota, as Travis mentioned, right? Minnesota or New Mexico or Montana, anything. So we look at regional diversity and diverse socioeconomic backgrounds. So that's what for us means diversity, because we're looking for that diverse experience to help us make Congress look more like America. So I just wanted to put those two on there.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for highlighting that. Yeah. Well, folks, we're at time. I wanted to really thank Betsy and Jabin, Brad, and Travis for these great insights. I think we should do this again, and really build out a broad campaign that includes individual businesses, as I mentioned, trade associations and business groups, and local chambers of commerce. Because I think, as Betsy said, for Congress to hear from its constituents, particularly the business community, about the importance of modernizing and updating the way it operates, that will certainly make an impact. So those of you listening today, please be in touch with us as we get this campaign moving. And again, thanks to all of our speakers, and everyone have a great afternoon. Thank you.